and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. The U.S. and China agreed to advance dialogue despite profound differences during Secretary Blinken's visit to Beijing. Today we discuss whether this is the beginning of a thaw in U.S.-Sino relations and how that impacts the Korean Peninsula.
The notion that we are seeking to economically contain them. We're not. And as I've said, we are not about decoupling, we're about de-risking.
国与国交往总要相互尊重，以诚相待。
China is in a unique position to press Pyongyang to engage in dialogue and to end its dangerous behavior.
In the studio with me, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, Mr. Snyder was the Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Center at the Asia Foundation. Mr. Snyder's new edited volume is titled North Korea's Foreign Policy, The Kim Jong-un Regime in a Hostile World. Also joining us, Dr. Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Cronin previously served as a Senior Director of the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Eun-jung.
Thank you.
Now, Dr. Cronin, did Secretary Blinken's visit to Beijing help Washington and Beijing avert collision? Is this a beginning of a thaw in U.S.-Sino relations?
Well, I think optimists would underscore that now we can have high-level negotiations. So when the two leaders met in Bali last November, there were great expectations that there might be some serious agreements coming from commerce, treasury, on climate change. All of those discussions have been held up, especially after the spy balloon incident in February. Now they're back on track, presumably, including a possible summit at APEC in San Francisco this November between Xi Jinping and President Biden. Pessimists would say none of the substantive issues have changed. The differences are indeed fundamental on issues from Taiwan to technology. The relationship is going to be still periodically destabilized. So I don't expect full stability, but a cold peace is maybe in the offing.
Then what do you make of the fact that China lashed back at President Biden, labeling Xi Jinping a dictator, and that China is preparing to build military training facility in Cuba?
Well, those are two very different issues. I mean, the president made some offhand remarks at a political fundraiser, and if you're in a democracy and you're at a fundraiser, you're trying to appeal to your audience, and I think that was sort of a safe discussion point to raise money around. And it's very different from the actual interests on which our policies are based. Cuba is a different matter. There it's interesting because it's part of a hidden, covert Chinese plan for global expansion around the world of both intelligence gathering and training facilities and port and airport access. And Cuba's 100 miles off the coast of Florida, my home state. So we take that very seriously, and that is a serious active kind of aggressive behavior by China.
When Secretary Blinken in Beijing, he said the U.S. does not support Taiwan's independence. Is he giving a confusing signal to the allies?
I don't think so. I think Secretary Blinken was speaking that part of the one China policy that the Chinese wanted to hear. It's not a part that we always say out loud because it's not the only aspect of our one China policy. As China tries to change the status quo, we think it's in our interest, in our ability to change the status quo along with them, and therefore increase training and access and assistance to Taiwan is necessary to keep up with what China's doing to be aggressive against Taiwan. But the reality is the one China policy that every administration has agreed to since we recognized relations with the PRC is that we do not support an independent Taiwan, but we also do not support any unilateral change to the status quo by coercion or force. And that's the point that we really agree on that China doesn't want to hear.
Mr. Snyder, isn't the United States and China in a structural, deep rivalry that the tensions between the two sides can anytime blow into a full-blown row?
Well, yes, I think so. In fact, I think that the conversation revealed how deep the disagreement is, because both sides are simply even unable to agree on whether or not they're in a competition, or whether or not it's better to manage the competition, or whether it's better to pretend that the competition does not exist as a way perhaps of encouraging both sides maybe to be risk averse because they know that guardrails aren't there. And so I thought that particular evidence of disagreement on how to characterize the relationship was really at the core of what was revealed through Blinken's visit.
Now, Dr. Cronin, despite Beijing's intransigence and chilly reception of Secretary Blinken, deep down, doesn't Beijing also think that it's better to explore better relations with the United States given the global international geopolitical situations?
Well, clearly, China turned out all of their senior leadership for Secretary of State Blinken. And they were cordial to the Secretary of State, even if they put him through his paces. I mean, 7 hours of meeting with your counterpart, and the next day, 3.5 hours with Wang Yi, the top diplomat, and then finally 35 minutes with the Secretary. That's a lot of hurdles to get your talking points across when you're jet lagged, and the human factor becomes an element. But the reality is the Chinese do want a better relationship. They do want a floor under the relationship. But they don't agree on some of the fundamental disagreements that Secretary Blinken brought up and that were apparent when they took offense with the president's offhand remark at the fundraiser. They don't like to talk about human rights. They don't want to talk about U.S. role in Taiwan's affairs. And there we're just going to have to agree to disagree.
Mr. Snyder, Washington and Beijing were very clear that they want to manage their relationship. Is this a moment of a sigh of relief for South Korea? Or is South Korea now in an environment where it can seek better relations with China?
Well, it should be, but I think that China and South Korea have been having their own bilateral problems. And a lot of that has centered around the remarks that Ambassador Xing made in public to an opposition leader, essentially telling South Korea not to bet on China by aligning itself too closely with the United States. And so I think that where this becomes very problematic is that it actually raises the prospect that China could actively use the difference in its efforts to effectively manage the relationship with the United States while neglecting China-South Korea relations in order to generate problems for the U.S. and South Korea in terms of their own alliance management coordination.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Cronin, Secretary Blinken said the U.S. is not out to economically contain China. Do you think now U.S. will soften its stance on excluding China from the semiconductor supply chain? Then would that mean that South Korean companies would have more room to be flexible in their investment and production in China?
Well, he's right that we're not trying to contain China. We have $650 billion a year of two-way trade with China. So it's in our interest to try to figure out how we can de-risk these critical technologies that we do worry about the vulnerabilities, that they could be weaponized by China. And we've seen them weaponize these issues from rare earths to semiconductor chips. So now the question of where do we set the limits on advanced semiconductor chips? And that's an ongoing negotiation, not just with China, but with Korea and with the Europeans, with Japan and others. And that's a policy that is evolving right now. And Congress has a vote in this. The White House has a vote. And what we're trying to do is to slow down the most advanced chips that could be used to modernize the PLA, the Chinese military, and could be used against us. That's the key aim here. Not to stop the trade with China, not to stop basic commodities flowing, and not to hurt our ally like Korea.
Mr. Snyder, those most advanced chips, the Samsung and SK Hynix are producing those most advanced chips. So is South Korean companies now caught in the middle of U.S.-China chip war? Is it too early to think for the South Korean companies to think that the chip war will ease?
Well, I think they are caught in the middle of the chip war. I think that's going to continue. But I also think that it's important to note that South Korean companies have made the important decision that the U.S. government wants to see, and that is, yes, there are legacy investments of less sophisticated chips that are continuing to be produced in South Korean factories in China. But the most modern and precise products, semiconductor products in the future, are going to be produced in factories like the one that Samsung is building in Texas and in other places not in China. And so I think that's the balance, and that is, in a way, that's the key element as related to decoupling versus de-risking. And that is that I think that the U.S. has tried to put forward a strategy that is focused on the technology competition itself at higher levels rather than a strategy that is designed to drive a wedge in the global economy between the Western economy and the China-centered economy.
Not decoupling and de-risking, that's what Secretary Yellen said, that's what Secretary Blinken said. And when the U.S. officials are emphasizing economic cooperation with China, then Dr. Cronin, wouldn't South Korean companies think that it is unfair for them because now they're facing more limitations than before in terms of investment and production in China?
Well, there are differences surely between some South Korean companies and America's exposure in China in the semiconductor field. But if you're Micron, an American company, and you've been sanctioned by China for reasons that they're not even explaining on alleged national security grounds, it's good to see that Micron is now going to invest nearly $800+ million in India on a new production facility here, as we've had Prime Minister Modi in town. But yes, South Korean businesses are heavily invested in China in this area as well. And that's why there has to be an ongoing negotiation and discussion between government and business, Seoul, the private sector, Washington, the private sector, on how to minimize the pain, but still achieve the kind of technological aims and goals that we both share that Scott has just talked about.
Mr. Snyder, Micron not only investing in India, but also announced new plans to invest in Xi'an, China, $600 million. Now, if American companies continue to invest in China, wouldn't Washington feel bound to not be able to further restrict South Korean companies to invest and produce in China in the future?
Well, I think it's true that one of the obstacles to the U.S. government imposing more stringent sanctions on China is the fact that it also hurts U.S. company interests. But as I look at the Micron investment, it's an investment in a packaging facility. It's a legacy investment related to a cooperative relationship with a Taiwanese company. And at the same time, Micron is investing in India, but they're also investing in a chip fab production facility, $3.6 billion in Japan. And so again, I think that actually emphasizes that the legacy investments may continue at the lower end of the supply chain, but all of the high-end investments on the most innovative products that are going to shape the future of science and technology, well, they are no longer going to be produced in China.
Dr. Cronin, you said Congress has a vote, White House has a vote, and Congress, there are strong voices that U.S. should even strengthen export control on China. Senator Rubio sent a letter to Secretary Raimondo to strengthen and finalize export control rule before industry and foreign interests can weaken it further. Wouldn't such strong calls from Congress also limit business activities for South Korean companies in China?
Well, they could, and that's why the executive branch, including Commerce Secretary Raimondo, have to balance the interests of the United States overall with our allies, as well as our commerce with China, and not just one senator or a group of senators who have more narrow perspectives on the need of export controls. But certainly, Senator Marco Rubio is right that we do need further export controls. We do need a consensus on them as well going forward, because we do have to make sure that our critical emerging technology areas don't leave us vulnerable to the weaponization and could be used against us by other militaries, especially by China's. So he's right to want more controls, but Secretary Raimondo has to balance the national interests of our allies and our overall national interests with China as well. So that's why executive branches need more maneuvering room than any one senator can talk about as they propose legislation.
Mr. Snyder, South Korea's opposition party is critical that the Yoon government has jumped on the bandwagon to decouple with China. And now that U.S. is emphasizing de-risking with China, with the U.S. now seeming to soften its stance on China, does this give lesson to the South Koreans that they should be more prudent next time, that they shouldn't jump on the bandwagon and try to balance between U.S. and China in the future?
Well, I think there is an underlying debate within South Korea about whether or not the Yoon administration might be going too far in its alignment with the United States. But I think that, I think in some ways it's too early to make a definitive judgment on that. Because if we just look, for instance, at what is happening in South Korea's overall trade balance, there's a major shift going on because semiconductors is no longer the cash cow in the China-South Korea relationship. And so that is sunsetting. And there is an issue related to cost sharing for the costs of adhering to U.S. sanctions policy. But at the same time, I think that what we see is this massive inward flow of Korean investment to the United States in a relatively new and expanding sector of EV batteries. And I think that increasingly what we're seeing is that the trade in that area is going to be, in some ways, compensatory for some of the losses that South Korean companies may face as a result of adherence to U.S. sanctions policy. And so on balance, we have to wait and see, but the way it's looking is that this is going to be a pendulum shift for South Korea that ultimately may actually end up working out. There still is a specific issue related to cost sharing for individual companies that have decided to remove themselves or decrease their exposure to the Chinese market. And I would say that we're going to see ongoing conversations on that issue in the context of the U.S.-Korea relationship.
I want to look at how the U.S. and China relations thaw is impacting North Korea. Now, Secretary Blinken in Beijing said that China is in a unique position to pressure North Korea to return to dialogue and stop its provocative actions. Dr. Cronin, does China have any substantive influence over North Korea?
Well, it certainly does. I mean, economic dependence has grown, actually, for North Korea. But that doesn't lead to political compliance by North Korea. Kim family is famously independently minded. I mean, the whole Juche policy was all about independence from major powers. But as inter-Korean relations and reconciliation have sort of gone by the boards from North Korea's perspective, and they don't see the Biden administration as honoring previous agreements and wanting better negotiations, then they really have no choice but to look to China and Russia. And in fact, part of the reason why the Kim family has been talking so much about Russia and supporting Russia's war in Ukraine, for instance, is they want a little more distance from China. But the reality is China does have that economic lever, but they're not really interested in using it for coercion against North Korea. Their concern is rivalry and competition with the United States. They do not feel threatened by North Korea. If they did, they would act.
I think China does have some types of influence on North Korea. Patrick has already kind of laid out some of the parameters on that. The challenge, of course, is that the North Koreans resent their dependency on China, and so they don't always adhere to what China would actually want. But really, the main frame here is the China-U.S. rivalry. And so in that context, I think that overall, China and North Korea are clearly more close together strategically. And that does give greater space, I think, to North Korea, broadly speaking, to do things. And also, one thing I think that we can say in the context of Sino-U.S. rivalry, if the U.S. asks China to help on North Korea, it's more likely that China will decide not to do it, possibly because the U.S. asked.
Mm-hmm. Now, Dr. Cronin, China's neighboring countries, South Korea and Japan, are boosting their military ties with the United States and expanding military exercises in the face of North Korean provocations. In this case, does North Korea's provocations pose a threat to China's security, or does China consider this a useful nuisance to U.S. and its allies and in turn serves China's national interest?
Well, it's interesting that even this newly released national intelligence estimate that was released this past week here in Washington said that the American intelligence community, as recently as January of this year, saw the nuclear buildup in North Korea through the rest of this decade as really primarily used for potential coercion, not actual use. That's the American intelligence assessment. So the Chinese assessment is presumably even to the left of that, thinking this is not a threat to China. And in fact, it is just a bit of coercion. It is a bit of brinkmanship, and we can manage that in Beijing just fine. So I don't think China is threatened per se by the nuclear buildup, even if they're not supportive of it, they're not wildly enthusiastic. They're willing to put up with it because it pushes the United States potentially into a harder position in the region to sustain over time. And they are hoping ultimately, like North Korea, to push the United States away from the continent and back across the Pacific. That's the Chinese objective here. And so dealing with North Korea is a lesser challenge for Beijing.
Mr. Snyder, when the tensions rise in the region, didn't China try to suppress North Korea and tame its actions?
That was the case in the past in a different geopolitical environment, before we had an environment that is framed by Sino-US rivalry. And I think that the interesting question that we're really trying to get at is to what extent, in the context of a closer China-North Korea strategic relationship, could China actually encourage tacitly North Korea to engage in provocations, or kind of silently cheer North Korea on the sidelines? In other words, where is the break, and to what extent is the break? At the same time, China does have more influence on North Korea, and so, for instance, the verdict is still out on whether China might have weighed in, for instance, on a 7th North Korean nuclear test. We just don't know.
Dr. Cronin, do you think the Trump administration's fire and fury strategy is worth revisiting at this point?
No, that would be my immediate answer. But of course, if you're asking it differently, in terms of is it worth trying to appeal to some new approach to high-level diplomacy with North Korea? Sure. I think they're wide open inside the Biden administration to figuring out, is there some novel way to reinitiate some dialogue on that could even lead to the arms control element, if you will, as it's been put. That's somewhat of a misnomer because that's not the end goal, but it states that there's a pragmatism in the diplomacy saying, could we do something just to lower the temperature, to reduce the potential for accidental conflict here, while we start a negotiation up and hopefully lead to long-term denuclearization. But if you're asking whether the Biden administration, in order to get there, should start threatening to attack North Korea, the bloody nose strategy that was famously put in the summer of 2017, no, we shouldn't do that because that is essentially threatening an act of war. We can do that in self-defense, but we can't just do that to initiate dialogue.
Mr. Snyder, Secretary Blinken emphasized Chinese influence over North Korea, just like his predecessors, him stressing the role of China. Does this show his frustration that all viable options have run out on North Korea?
Well, it's often the case, I think, that the default option, if you can't find a way to move forward with North Korea, is to try to put it in China's court. Just like another default option when you're frustrated is to apply more sanctions on North Korea. We'll have to wait and see, but one point related to what Patrick was just talking about, the Biden administration can talk about engaging North Korea, but so far, North Korea during the pandemic has sent no demand signal for diplomatic engagement. And I think that probably a demand signal from North Korea in one form or another is a necessary prerequisite for the Biden administration to try to respond with some kind of dialogue.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Snyder, Dr. Cronin, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.